Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, the Spreadsheet and SOX, the never-ending battle. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. We have with us Michael Rasmussen, who's also known as the GRC Pundit based in Chicago, and Henry Umney, Director from Cluster 7. Both Michael and Henry have extensive experience in the world of governance, risk and compliance, and are looking forward to sharing and discussing this topic with you further today. The webinar itself was brought about by a piece of research that Cluster 7 commissioned Michael to carry out late last year, focusing on end-user computing and the potential challenges it causes to organisations. Michael will make reference to this piece during some of his session. If any of you have not been able to look at the research, please do let us know and we can make sure that you receive a copy. Just before we start, I thought I'd give a little bit of background around Cluster 7. Cluster 7 is based in London, New York and Boston, and is the leader in spreadsheet management software. Spreadsheet management has always been our sole focus, and we have over a decade and a half of specialist experience and support to offer our customers. Leading enterprises worldwide, many operating in highly regulated industries, trust us to help them to increase visibility and control of their Excel spreadsheets, access databases, and other end-user computing applications. So now I'd like to hand over to Michael, who will be sharing his experience.
I muted myself. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking forward to be able to talk to everybody for this next virtual hour on what is a critical topic, and that's the use of end-user computing, particularly spreadsheets, in critical business processes such as financial and accounting processes that are governed by Sarbanes-Oxley. So with no further ado, why don't we begin here and move forward? Just a second here. I'm trying to advance the slides. I don't know if I'm sorry, do I have keyboard and mouse control? Because it doesn't seem to be responding to me advancing the slide.
Giving it to you. There we go.
There we go. Okay. So now if you look at types of data in the organization, we have lots and lots of data. Organizations are permeated with data. We're in what we've been talking about for the last decade, the era of big data. So you look at things, we have structured data, like in databases. We have, in some level, structured data would be considered spreadsheets as well. Unstructured data, like in documents. We've got, different dark data and rogue data, duplicated and redundant data out of there. In general, data itself is just pervasive throughout the enterprise. The organization has data all over, and it's not always reliable, and things get replicated and out of date. And different solutions doing analyzing things like spreadsheets and things get modified and adjusted, and the organization becomes significantly at risk. Looking a little bit deeper at this, besides the range of different types of data out there, we have the end-user computing applications that use data, and particularly here I'm talking about word processors and spreadsheets, and most particularly spreadsheets. But we could also throw things in here like collaborative sites like SharePoint, email, and things like that, that try to build workflows and things out of documents and spreadsheets. And so we can throw that in end-user computing applications themselves as well. But in general, what I want to focus on is spreadsheets and to some levels documents and word processing documents as well. And the challenges I'm seeing upon organizations and what the regulators are cracking down on. And in fact, if you go back a decade, I've been on my own for GRC 2020 research for the last 10 years, and before that I spent 7 years at Forrester. Even back in my Forrester days, I was in the early days of Sarbanes-Oxley, I was saying spreadsheets and documents by themselves can introduce significant regulatory compliance challenges to organizations because they lack integrity. Anybody can do anything to paint a rosier picture and get themselves out of trouble because spreadsheets don't have the right audit trail and integrity by themselves. If there aren't additional solutions wrapped around them, we don't have the right level of integrity and audit trails to address spreadsheets being used in regulated processes like Sarbanes-Oxley. I was saying that a decade ago. Now you roll back the last couple of years, and you have the PCAOB cracking down on external auditors, and external auditors now applying pressure to organizations to provide more internal controls around end-user computing applications such as spreadsheets in Sarbanes-Oxley type governed processes and in other areas. In fact, I was talking to one mid-sized regional bank last year, and they told me that the Federal Reserve was cracking down on them, that their use of spreadsheets and documents for compliance purposes just won't pass audit trail and accountability to support compliance processes. Further, you see things like, significant incidents out there, like we had like the JP Morgan whale incident and things. And one of the significant contributing factors to a multi-billion-dollar loss was a spreadsheet error. So lots of challenges with end-user computing applications, particularly spreadsheets, greater regulatory pressure and things. So some of those pressures in themselves is the lack of accountability. Anybody can do anything with spreadsheets and documents. And we have this like within different like financial models and things like that were built for a specific purpose, and somebody wants to take that and use it for a different purpose. And it was never really designed for that. And people just take what they think might be a good fit. And it was never tested and designed. And there's lack of accountability in what's done. There's no audit trail or change control. So if I modify a formula or something like that in a spreadsheet, spreadsheets by themselves, you have no integrity in the audit trail and change control of the spreadsheet, because something might have changed and been manipulated either on purpose or with or without malicious intent, or maybe even inadvertently something was deleted or modified in a formula, and no longer is that spreadsheet reliable. And we can't go back and say who made what modification on what date and time, what was modified, and that's not going to stand up for organizations anymore. They need stronger audit trails and change controls in spreadsheets and end-user computing applications. There's greater compliance and audit challenges, and I've already mentioned the PCAOB and focus of external auditors on end-user computing applications used in accounting and financial processes. I mentioned, the bank that I mentioned, where the Federal Reserve was saying, your use of spreadsheets for documentation of compliance isn't good enough. But then you look at mistakes and errors, where I referenced things like the JP Morgan whale incident. You have the pervasiveness of spreadsheets and documents, where they're just so easy to use, and they'll be continued to be easy to use because they're on everybody's desktop, and they're pervasive throughout the enterprise. But they can, at that same time, they can become overwhelming complex and integrity, and people might take a spreadsheet and keep adding to it and making new formulas and adjustments, and they're never really tested, stress tested and things to make sure that that spreadsheet is actually providing accurate results and numbers that the business might be relying on, even though there's significant business criticality. All these points really relate to each other, as you can see here. So there's significant challenges with the use of end-user computing applications, particularly spreadsheets, that we're finding in these processes. And I'm not advocating that these need to go away. What I'm advocating is organizations have to have better controls on that. And that's what the regulators are advocating too, that you have to have internal controls over end-user computing applications used in critical business processes. Leonardo da Vinci said, realize that everything connects to everything else. That, that spreadsheet is crunching numbers and analyzing data and presenting reports and things that, impact business strategy and direction, that presents figures and operations of the organization. And we need to be able to understand completely, the role of spreadsheets out there in the organization. Now, when you talk to organizations, you often find that they even lack a basic understanding of the inventory of the spreadsheets used in critical financial accounting and other compliance type processes within their organization. Or they don't even have an understanding of what spreadsheets are out there and how they're being used at a detailed level. They might have some rudimentary understanding of some business critical spreadsheets here and there, but no inventory of them across the organization and how they're being used and any type of documentation on different audits and validation that those spreadsheets are fit for the purpose they're being used for. But as Leonardo da Vinci stated, everything does connect to everything else, and one little spreadsheet error could cause significant issues for the organization. And that's why we need stronger internal controls over spreadsheets, documents, and end-user computing controls in general. Which sort of reminds me of the chaos of risk interconnectedness. When you look at chaos theory, and chaos theory is the understanding that the flutter of a butterfly's wings, like in the Netherlands, can have tiny atmospheric change that can create tiny atmospheric changes that can influence the development and path of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. And so what might seem like an insignificant issue with a spreadsheet could have devastating results and significant loss to the organization. The case in point there, again, as I referenced, like the JP Morgan whale incident, where a spreadsheet error was one of the significant contributing factors to a multi-billion-dollar loss for JP Morgan in the whale incident. And so we need to be able to understand that interconnectedness of risk that Spreadsheets brings to the organizations and how to control them, particularly in Sarbanes-Oxley type-related compliance processes. You know, to use another analogy of the intricate risk environment, I like to reference the Titanic. Captain E.J. Smith stated, "Never in all history have we harnessed such formidable technology. Every scientific advancement shown to man, every scientific advancement known to man has been incorporated into its design. The operational controls are sound and foolproof." Well, the Titanic sank on its maiden voyage. What went wrong? We had overconfidence in the ship's design, and it's right there from the captain, but also from the press. The front page of the newspaper said the Titanic was unsinkable. So you had overconfidence. How often are we overconfident in our business, and we're relying on data and things that might not be completely accurate because there's lack of internal controls over things like end-user computing, and we're making business decisions and things without seeing the full picture of things. So what went wrong with the Titanic? Well, it wasn't just about a ship hitting an iceberg. There was multiple risk factors involved. For one thing, there's environmental factors. Well, first off, you had overconfidence in ship's design, as I mentioned. You had to push to get it across the Atlantic quickly to show its speed and power of the day. We had external environmental factors. It happens that this period of 1912, there's already global warming, and the northern Arctic ice shelf is breaking up and bringing icebergs further south into the Atlantic. In fact, tidal moon poles of January, February, March 1912 were of a significant nature, stronger nature, that were bringing those icebergs further south into the shipping lanes, causing more hazards than were normally there. You had environmental health and safety issues in which there wasn't the proper number of life preservers and lifeboats for the number of passengers on board. They tell us that the size of the rudder and size of the propeller were undersized for the size of the ship. And you can see the analogy here as we rely on spreadsheets and things like that. You know, they might indicate that everything looks good, but if we dig deeper, we find out, well, no, there's an error here. You know, the size of the rudder and size of the propeller, as the analogy, doesn't really fit for what we're trying to deliver here in the organization as far as strategy and performance. They tell us that the iron ore used in the rivets was of an inferior and brittle quality. There's audit and oversight functions. One of the warnings coming to the Titanic through telegraph was, you know, icebergs are in the area. One of the responses back from the Titanic was, "Shut up, I'm tired of hearing about it." You know, how often are we seeing that? You know, you need to take care of end-user computing controls and spreadsheet controls and Sarbanes-Oxley and critical processes. Shut up, I'm tired of hearing about it. You know, that was a response back from the Titanic operations to a telegraph about warnings about icebergs in the area. They had binoculars to scan the ocean for hazards, but the binoculars were locked away in a cabinet. And the crew member that had the keys to the cabinet was assigned duty to another ship right before it set sail. Organizations have tools to manage end-user computing controls and spreadsheets, but they fail to use them and invest in them. And so that's like the binoculars being locked away in the cabinet. And lastly, the Titanic was headed towards the iceberg, and it was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded. If it would have hit it dead on, only 2 compartments would have flooded. When it decided to hit on its side, 6 compartments flooded, combined with the weak iron ore and the rivets. And my whole point is that businesses are complex, just like the Titanic. And you address any 1 or 2 of those risk issues, and you might not ever have had the disaster we now know as the Titanic. But your business is just as complex as the Titanic, and you need to be able to see the big picture, that interconnectedness of risk, the chaos of the butterfly's wings in the spreadsheet air and how it can cause damage, the interconnectedness of information and everything, as Leonardo da Vinci said, realize that everything connects to everything else. We need to see the big picture. We need to understand how end-user computing controls are being used in the organization and provide accountability and audit trails and controls over those spreadsheets and other end-user computing applications to be able to have reliable, consistent outcomes and operations and meet compliance obligations and objectives. That's what we're talking about today. So when you look at how organizations are using spreadsheets and other end-user computing controls, it reminds me of the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. This is a sprawling mansion that was built in the 1800s by the heiress to the Winchester fortune. It cost $5.5 million to build in the 1800s. That's one expensive house today. It took 38 years to build. And at the end of the day, it's got 160 rooms, 47 fireplaces, 6 kitchens, 10,000 windows. It's got doors that open to walls. You open the door and there's a wall there. It's got staircases that go up or down to nowhere. It's got skylights in floors instead of ceilings. And you wonder, how did this happen? Well, it had no design, no blueprint, no architect, but it had 147 different builders over 38 years. And so it doesn't make sense at the end of the day. This is like many of the organizations, like those on the phone here. Instead of 10,000 windows, you've got 10,000 spreadsheets and documents being used that aren't really controlled and monitored in the environment. And over the last, couple decades, you've got, 147 different people, building their own spreadsheets to use for critical business processes and financial accounting processes their way without any control or design around those. But the business, relies on these, but there hasn't been any good validation and control over them to ensure that they're providing accurate information in the environment and consistent information. The use of end-user computing controls, end-user computing applications without controls is very much like the mystery around the Winchester Mystery House. So when I talk to organizations on the use of end-user computing controls, they're often telling me they have an inability to gain a clear view of dependencies, even an inventory of what spreadsheets are being used out there for what purpose. There's a high cost of consolidating information and reporting and trying to make sure that information is accurate. They have a failure to trend across different assessment and periods for internal controls or financial reporting. And they can't really understand the correlation of risk and understand that risk and provide it in context. And it gets even more complex when they're trying to respond to the volume of changing business environment, new employees that come in, they bring spreadsheets that they've used for other purposes with them and try to adapt them to those purposes, and they're never probably adequately tested. Changing businesses and processes and strategy and changing laws and regulations and regulatory focus like the PCAOB crackdown on end-user computing controls, so then putting pressure on external auditors. And organizations are finding that they're behind the game. They're like the guy that's on the high wire on a bike trying to juggle. And we need better ways to address this and deal with this in the environment so that we can more effectively manage internal controls over financial reporting, particularly within spreadsheets. So I did some research and survey, and one of the questions I asked was, does your organization have a thorough understanding of end-user computing solutions that might present a risk to your financial reports? And what's shocking there is nearly 50%, 49% of the organizations that responded said that they do not. That's half the organizations out there that say that they don't have a good understanding of end-user computing solutions like spreadsheets and desktop databases that might present a risk to their financial reports. That's significant. Then I asked the question, have you identified the spreadsheets and desktop databases where material misstatements could arise? Again, nearly half the organizations out there don't have a good inventory of what spreadsheets and desktop databases are being used that could present a risk to misstatements. And then we asked the question, are your external auditors applying tougher standards in the application of this PCAOB guidance on end-user computing controls? Nearly a quarter of organizations, 22%, said yes, there's a lot of pressure, extreme pressure. Another quarter said 25%, a quarter said moderate pressure. 31% said somewhat, we're seeing increased pressure here, but it's not necessarily moderate or extreme. And only 22% said that they're not seeing any pressure from their external auditors. So you do the math here, and we've got basically 78% of organizations are seeing some level of increased pressure from their external auditors on end-user computing controls. So end-user computing controls understood in context of GRC, governance, risk management, and compliance. The definition of GRC is that GRC is the integrated collection of capabilities that enables an organization to reliably achieve objectives, that's the governance function, while addressing uncertainty, that's risk management, and active integrity, that's compliance. Now, end-user computing controls are aspects of the GRNC. We need end-user computing controls so we can reliably achieve objectives. If we do not have controls over spreadsheets and critical financial and accounting processes, then how can we reliably achieve objectives? We can't rely on the information being presented in these critical business processes using spreadsheets, then we should be questioned whether we can reliably achieve objectives. If we don't have end-user computing controls, we have a significant level of uncertainty in those spreadsheets and desktop databases and word processing documents and so it reports, and that means we have greater risk and exposure, and we can't meet our compliance obligations like the increased pressure from the PCAOB. So organizations have to understand the individual risks within end-user computing, like specific spreadsheet risks and things that they have, as well as the interconnected of those risks and how that one potential spreadsheet error can cascade and cause significant damage to the organization's strategy and loss to the organization. We need to be able to see the tree and the forest, the individual spreadsheet and the risk it poses, as well as how it cascades and can intersects with business strategy and objectives and performance and reporting that can cause even greater damage and exposure to the organization. You need to be able to see the tree and the forest. So the way a lot of organizations are approaching end-user computing controls, particularly spreadsheets, and the lack of controls around them, is like Hercules fighting the Hydra, in which you chop off one of its head and multiple heads grow up in it to replace it. That we have so many spreadsheets and end-user computing applications being used and no technology that is being implemented within organizations to properly manage this across the organization and successfully address this. So it takes a lot of time that the organization doesn't have and excessive resources. There's hundreds to thousands of documents, spreadsheets, and emails to monitor and govern, and doing that manually is just an impossible task. You have poor visibility reporting, documents are out of sync, they have rogue data, out-of-date data, they haven't been tested or validated in ages, which means they're overwhelmingly complex, and there's no accountability that needs to be there within these organizations. So we asked the question on the survey next: do you have controls around end-user computing solutions, in particular spreadsheets and desktop databases? And you can see a trend here that nearly half the organizations out there lack controls around spreadsheets and desktop databases. Only about half the organizations have addressed some level of controls around these spreadsheets. But let's look further here at what types of controls these are. So what types of controls they are? Nearly half of them are manual controls and processes. So we have half the organizations out there that say that they have controls, and half of those that stated that they have some levels of controls say that they're manual controls and processes. And only 20% of those that have controls around them have automated those. So a lot of organizations are relying on a lot of staff time and energy at significant cost to try to manage end-user computing controls in their applications when there's better, more efficient, effective, and agile ways of doing this. Finally, we asked the question, is your organization undertaking any new processes or technology improvements in the area of system-generated data and reports to meet the tougher accounting standards? And here we have found that 60% of organizations that we surveyed said, yes, we are trying to make improvements in technology and process to address greater controls over end-user computing applications like spreadsheets. So let's dive into my foundation of what technology can provide for end-user computing controls. And our host is going to go into more detail here after I'm done in just a couple minutes here. But, strong controls over spreadsheets and other end-user computing applications like desktop databases gives us good reporting. You have an inventory of what's being used out there, how it's being used, and streamlines the reporting and the accuracy of the reporting. It provides audit trails of who modified that spreadsheet and on what day and when, what was modified, and if we need to roll back, we can roll back on that. It provides proper workflow and tasks when there's issues and remediation and things need to be looked into and investigated. It helps us provide better collaboration in the environment by providing a good structured inventory of what's out there and how it can be used and reference so that people know what can be used out there and what's available to them. And then there's automated enforcement of controls to make sure that there's no policy violations or failures and that any exceptions of use of different spreadsheets and things are being documented as well. And so, technology helps us enforce controls throughout the environment over spreadsheets and desktop databases. It enables us to take in a variety of these distributed and disconnected documents and spreadsheets out there and desktop databases, integrate and map how they're being used and the controls there, analyze and understand relationships of how they're being used, and build out action items to improve controls over them and to address issues that we find in those. So developing an end-user computing strategy requires what I would say is a top-down approach. First off, we need to build the strategy. How are we governing end-user computing controls in our organization? And who's responsible for that? What are the areas of concern? Is it just Sarbanes-Oxley, or is it areas like model risk management within financial services and things? What's the breadth and scope of the concern around end user computing controls in our environment? And then what are the processes in place to manage end user computing controls? How do we keep an inventory? How do we do proper validation and stress testing of spreadsheets and things to make sure they're providing accurate information? And then what's the right information technology architecture to automate this strategy and process in the organization? Manual approaches are not going to work for organizations, particularly organizations of any size. They're going to need some level of technology to be able to automate and enforce the end user computing controls over spreadsheets and other end user computing applications like desktop databases and things like that. And so we need to have technology that can automate that can support the strategy and process. So technology to control end-user computing delivers the ability to ensure that ownership and accountability of information found in spreadsheets that is there, and that there can be proper collaboration, but that there's proper accountability in that collaboration. And it enables us to manage ongoing business impact of risk exposure in the context of end-user computing. It allows us to integrate intelligence that establishes workflow and tasks when issues in end-user computing applications like spreadsheets arise that impact the organization, and particularly in context of improper use of spreadsheets. Helps us to monitor the organization's environment for the dissemination, access, and control of information across end-user computing solutions. It helps us identify changes in risk and compliance and control profiles for spreadsheets that expose information, and it helps us visualize the impact of a change on the organization's process and operations in the context of how individuals are using end-user computing applications like spreadsheets. Now, I set the stage here for a lot in providing context and how technology can enable and deliver value here. Now I'm going to turn this over to our hosts now, where they can show us specifically how their solution is doing this and delivering on this.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael, for that insight into how spreadsheets are affecting the office of the CFO, and in particular some of the SOX controls. I guess here at Cluster 7 we can definitely relate to the issues that you outlined firms are facing from spreadsheets. Interestingly, from our experience and feedback in the marketplace, is very much aligned to the results that you got from your survey. In particular, if I pick out a couple of those, we're definitely seeing firms under pressure from the PCAOB, making them look at their SOX controls and increasing those controls and looking to automation, which we'll come on to a little later. And I guess dovetail into that is, in the main in the marketplace, controls where they exist, and again, from Michael's research, only was it 53% of people had controls. Where they do exist, again, we see that in the main those controls are manual. I guess that begs the question, so given there's so much risk associated with the use of spreadsheets, should we expect there to be more mistakes? Michael outlined a number of sort of stories that have made the press of misstatements or errors associated with the use of spreadsheets. We also know from talking to people in the marketplace from firms that the vast majority of mistakes, misstatements, sending clients the wrong reports, sending the wrong set of accounts to stock exchange, actually don't make the public domain. So I guess very much like the iceberg analogy, the ones that hit the press are very much in the minority to those that exist. So I guess what I'd like to explore is how effective are the controls that exist today around end user computing. Let's see if I can get control. Okay, so as Michael's research suggested, only 20% of organizations have automated the controls around spreadsheets. So I think it's worth exploring some of the dynamics around the majority of the controls, which are, in this case, manual. I guess our observation in looking at some of those manual controls shows that most organizations, the people within the organizations that are responsible for those controls, set aside rather large amounts of time to do this checking. So they're mitigating the risk with a lot of checking. And you'll see typically in people's calendars, certainly in the finance department, when it comes around to month-end reporting, blocking out large portions of their diaries to do the month end, which includes quite a lot of time allocated to checking those spreadsheets and those models. And interestingly, if you take the next level down and look at some of the spreadsheets that people have shared with us that they use in some of these month-end processes, you typically see a sort of runbook or an instructions in the first sheet within a spreadsheet that tells the user not only how to update and run the model, but also what checks should be performed. And I recall talking to a user a few years ago when we were talking through the checks that they had documented in the spreadsheet, and asked, is this the extent of how you need to check the spreadsheet? And she replied that actually she'd like to do a lot more checks, but really time did not permit them to do this. So because that it was very manually intensive. So I guess the question is, how, as Michael said, how can we move away from those manual checks and towards automation? And I guess to illustrate to illustrate not only not only the risks associated, but the time associated with this. I'll give you an example of one time and motion study that we did with a risk department. At a high level, what we did was we studied initially what was the day-to-day activity of the staff within that organization. And in this case, the majority of the work that they undertook was in spreadsheets. If we then took it down to the next level and looking at one of those processes, which involved 5 people on a daily basis effectively checking 50 very large spreadsheets. And as Michael said, in the main, most people, and certainly the senior management of the organization, did not understand that. And really in understanding and unearthing and understanding the processes that were being enacted here, it resulted in this case, an ROI of over $500,000 a year. And what this enabled them to do was not only to de-risk the process, and we'll come on to that in a second, but it also allowed the organization to reallocate those resources to do more meaningful work within the organization. And the ROI was really around just reducing the cost of that process itself. And as Michael said, there is so much pressure in the office of the CFO to do more and more functions. If there is an ability to make tasks more robust, to automate them, then it allows you to reassign those resources to do other things that, or the ever-increasing amount of work that's required from the from that part of the organization. I guess interestingly, in doing this analysis around this one process, we also uncovered or we replicated an error that they had been fined for, in fact, for misstating something, and realized that the operator, because of the information they were provided with, would never have been able to find the error. So not only do they have a vast amount of people checking these things, the data that it had to check it was not sufficient for them to unearth these errors. So again, not only making those processes more efficient, but also greatly de-risking that process. So I guess Michael talked about that sort of the iceberg. So why do these issues exist? So if we take a step back, in an ideal world at a high level, our IT architecture would hopefully look something like what we have on the screen. We have a number of source systems that are providing information. And depending on the reports that we in the finance department need to create, whether we're looking at the CCAR reporting, some of the new IFRS 9 or Sarbanes-Oxley reporting, generally what we're looking at is trying to pull data from a number of systems, and maybe some of those are identified as key spreadsheets that have some of that data. They go through some form of ETL layer, some manipulation of that data, and then whether it's the finance reporting modules, risk modules, warehouses, data lakes are being populated from which reports are generated. So that, in theory, is the world that our organizations live in. I think the reality is somewhat different. the complexity of aggregating the data, the complexity of each of those individual systems as we sort of peel back the onion, gives us a very different picture. And the predominance of end-user computing, of spreadsheets, access databases, and other end-user controlled technology is much more dominant within those data flows, which is, as we've explored earlier, introduces risks, but also massive inefficiencies within within the organization. But again, if we take Michael's sort of iceberg analogy, if we just looked at even one of these processes that is, in theory a spreadsheet that's feeding, in this case, a reporting warehouse, the exposure of that iceberg can be quite interesting. So, in effect, from that diagram, what we had was a single file feeding our risk model, but actually what we tend to find, and through technology what you can do is expose that actually that one file does not live in isolation. It is also reliant and requires gathering data from, in this case, 27 other spreadsheets and other databases that it requires to be able to aggregate that data. Now, were it to be that simple that it was a single layer, we find that layer is dependent on, again, itself has its dependencies, they and their I also have their dependencies, and what you end up with is, and this is not untypical, we see this across different industries, across different departments. It's not uncommon to find what we knew about this single file that's quite important to our organization, but what we were unaware of is its dependence on 500 other spreadsheets that support the data aggregation to be able to enable that reporting process. So I guess, say this is real world example of Michael's iceberg. Maybe it's also an example of sort of your old Winchester house. When we started, it may have started out as a single spreadsheet, but as the organization evolved, or as the reporting got more complex, data had to be collected from other areas, the spreadsheet evolved itself, and these models grow up and the complexity grows up. It evolves over time. So I guess the question is, how can technology help in that real world? So we've talked a little bit about the discovery, and what we had on that previous screen, our spider map exposing that the iceberg and exposing those data connections. So we have the ability, as I say, in that time and motion study, to be able to look at and understand usage, to be able to understand connectivity, to be able to understand the technical riskiness of some of those files. So I may have 10 key files that I rely on. How complex are they relative to each other? If you talk to an actuary, they may say a model is simple. To any mere mortal like myself, for example, an actuary's simple model looks quite complex to me. So being able to benchmark those files and have a common understanding of their technical complexity is important. So from there, and again, as Michael said, the key to successfully managing the risk associated with spreadsheets and being able to implement those controls is really to understand and maintain that inventory of those files. So through the discovery, we are able to unearth the full dependency, the dependencies we have around end-user computing. But through maintaining that registry, what we're doing is ensuring we understand that ownership, we understand the area that the spreadsheet is in, the processes that it's supporting, but also importantly, how material is that spreadsheet to the organization. So by running that technical complexity and now being able to overlay the materiality, you now get a true picture of the risks that the organization faces associated with the uses of end-user computing to support some of those key processes. The other interesting thing in pulling that inventory together, a lot of people departments have individual inventories, by pulling it all together in a single inventory for the organization, it does start to, you get to understand that there's duplication. So people are running similar processes, running different models for the same process. So there's a lot of consolidation that can occur. But also it becomes the first time that an organization can really understand, in effect, where the holes are in the IT architecture, where there has been underfunding. So you can start understanding where you can invest your IT dollars to be able to plug those gaps and to effectively retire some of those end-user computing applications. So the inventory becomes very important to be able to align, well, to understand the risk of the organization, but then it will be able to align the IT strategy with being able to be able to mitigate some of that risk. So for the spreadsheets that do remain, that haven't been replaced or are not duplicates, how can technology help maintain that integrity to demonstrate the controls? And I guess the way we look at it is there's sort of three key elements to that change control piece. The first is around the security of the file. So being able to maintain a version history. So we know, when auditors come in, they can see the January month-end file. They've got the copy of that file at that time as attested by the users. You're monitoring who has the correct access to that file, so you can ensure that only the right people have access and can see those files. Any passwords or protection that you have on the file to ensure that is all in place. And then from a structural or functional perspective, creating an audit trail of all the changes that occurred at a structural level. So whether you're adding and removing worksheets, changing any of those links that exist, whether you're changing macro code or formulas, being able to have an audit trail of understanding who did what, where and when within that file. But also, importantly, from a security, who has access to it, making sure it functions correctly. For any application, you go through a release program to do that, and then it's all about the data that flows through. So what technology can also do is and what Class 7 can do, is to also put the data controls in place, the data validation. So, for example, you may have some market data coming into your worksheet, so you would expect that to update month on month, so you don't have any stale data. Again, a very good example, one of our clients that misstated some of their accounts to the stock exchange because they hadn't noticed they had stale data in one of their workbooks. But also, so being able to then look at tolerances, things move outside of certain tolerance boundaries and ensuring reconciliation. So what Cluster 7 is able to do is at all of these different levels is be able to capture the status quo, but also when there are any changes or significant changes to those, we can generate alerts to the key people that own those processes, so they are aware, or their managers are aware. And also you're able to, if you wish, to enable a review and approval process around those changes. So when an auditor comes in to, for example, to check some of the SOX controls around some month-end reporting, they can see the January month-end, they can see the right people had access, they can see any changes from the December, what has changed, and if there are any significant changes, the reviews and approvals that happened at that time. So what Cluster 7 is doing is automatically capturing the audit trail and facilitating the documentation around any key changes that have occurred. So that's how we can help. I guess from an example perspective, trying to bring this into context, some real examples, and again, a lot of this talks to some of the requirements that Michael said organizations have MC. So at a high level, you're able to see your EUCs and spreadsheets across the globe by different type, complexity, department, how you're doing in the recertification process. We then go down to, oops, excuse me, just go back one. Oh no, hang on, how do I go back? Oh. Sorry, Laura, can you just go back? Thank you. Hang on, I seem to have lost control. Okay, so for example, now I'm in a department. I'm in a certain area. I can see the key spreadsheets that exist within my department. I may have been out last week. I can now see who's made changes to the spreadsheets within my area at a summary level. I can then go down to see exactly how these things change, how macro codes change, data connection changes, side-by-side comparison on how the actual cells have changed. So what we bring to life is a very simple user experience in being able to take a reasonably complex problem, which is understanding how spreadsheets have changed between version to version, be able to allow organizations to capture that data, the evidence very easily, to be able to attach any form of sign-off or certification from those end users as well, and that's all encapsulated within the technology. We have quite a great number of organizations use our technology. Quite a number of those are happy to share their experiences via branded case studies. Some of them are on the screen here today, and there are more on our website. I think that was really me. Laura, can I hand back to you and see if there are any questions?
Thanks, Henry. We've had a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, I'll sort of stick with you, Henry, while we've got you here. So someone's up in saying that technology is often seen as the silver bullet, but long-term can fail to deliver the desired results. What advice would you give to anyone looking to use technology as part of their end-user computing governance strategy?
Good question. I think I go back to what Michael said. I think technology plays a part in being able to provide transparency around what people are doing, but it really has to be set at the governance level, defining roles and responsibilities. What are we trying to achieve? So if I have, for example, a key model in the finance process, it's assigning the roles and responsibilities and saying that and largely this exists today. I am, as the manager of the area, I should be responsible for the data and the results that I produce. However, unless you have a tool like Cluster 7, it's actually very difficult for me to understand exactly how my team have updated those files. So by giving me the responsibility to sign off on that, I need to have I need to be able to understand what my team have done. So through the lens of the technology, my team would update those files. Key changes are then highlighted. They would provide the documentation or the reasons for those changes, and that gives me the ability to review. So yes, technology can do lots of things, but it really has to be coming down to assigning the responsibility and the accountability to people. And secondly, ensuring that your second and third line defense, so your operational risk people and audit people, are ensuring that those controls are in place.
Okay, thank you. So just one more leading on to that before I've got a couple of questions for Michael. So kind of if managing sort of spreadsheets and end-user computing applications is so important, why isn't everybody using technology to help them do it?
I think first and foremost, a lot of people are not aware that there's technology out there to automate this and make things more efficient, effective, and agile. And so to me, it's more of an awareness challenge to let people know that, this pressure that they're getting, there's ways to automate this and do so with less resources and make things more effective, efficient, and agile in the environment. And that's actually how I measure value for a solution like Cluster 7 to automate this. Is how does this solution make me more value and more efficient and time saved, dollars saved? So in employee FTE time, or just translating that to overall dollars from time saved too. So how does the technology make me more efficient? The second area is how does it make it more effective? Before my controls are manual processes and I can only do so much random sampling and things. of controls on end user computing controls. Now I can do 100% enforcement, and my auditors have greater reliance. And that's another place where we can go back for efficiency for dollars saved is, maybe the external auditors are spending less time testing and validating themselves now because they got greater reliance on the automated enforcement of controls. And so there's dollars saved as well as time saved there. And so how does it make more efficient? And then the other efficient and effective. And then the third angle is agile. My business is constantly changing. The use of spreadsheets are constantly changing. How do I keep up with all that change and not be constantly behind the game? And there's a value equation there as well.
Thanks for that, Michael. So another question to you. Have you seen a change in the way organisations are behaving as a result of increased focus from the likes of the PCAOB?
Can you repeat the question once more?
Have you seen a change in the way that organisations are behaving as a result of increased focus from the likes of the PCAOB?
I would say definitely, because right now what I see is organizations are starting to ask a lot of questions on how do we approach end-user computing controls. Over the last couple of years, as the PCAOB has started to crack down on external auditors there, I've seen a growing awareness. So, I teach internal control management by design workshops, and they've been very well attended this last year. And one of the things that's come up significantly is the number of organizations that are saying we're seeing a crackdown on internal controls over end-user computing. How do we approach that? Well, are there solutions out there for this? Is it manual processes? So I've seen a definite change in people asking questions, trying to figure out what their strategy is to approach this.
Henry, have you got any viewpoints on that from from the UK side?
I guess I echo what Michael says. We are, I guess, in the main, most people say SOX controls are done, but we are seeing people coming to us now saying that they are having to address this. People, as I say, people are looking to increase the level of control or visibility that they have around those finance processes in order to meet their SOX controls now. So I guess 10 years ago it was, SOX controls were all vogue. I guess it was done, but it looks like it's got a resurgence now.
Okay, thank you. And so last question, again back to you, Michael. With the potential for deregulation under the new administration in the US, what advice would you give to practitioners when looking at their kind of operational risk strategies?
I don't think it's really going to impact this area because this is an area where SOX is there. It's been there for a long time. I see more of the administration focusing a lot on the Dodd-Frank Act. So there seems to be a lot of area for deregulation. But internal controls is good for business. This isn't just a compliance issue. And external audit, I think, is going to keep this on the radar and agenda no matter what. So because it's a hot area and a significant area with some issues and themes that we've explored. But it isn't just a compliance and audit issue. It's also a business performance strategy issue. If we have errors and things in these spreadsheets that can lead to significant damage to the organization, it's an area that internal controls just make sense in automating those controls.
Okay, thank you. And I've just seen we've got another question has come in. Just hold on 1 second. So, yeah, we've got a question here. So, with respect to SOX, many business units rely on entity-level controls or higher-level analytics versus individual EUC controls. In your experience, how do we change culture? How do we change culture that the risks are real at a lower level, and that and that the higher level controls or analytics may not catch the big one in all? So the final bit of that was, in your experience, how do we change culture that the risks are real at a lower level, and that the higher level controls or analytics may not catch the big one in all? So either Henry or Michael want to have a go answering that one?
Yeah, I mean, Laura, it's Henry. I guess a lot of this comes down to, I think, a definition of a policy that effectively will define the risk appetite for the organisation on a consistent basis. And rather than doing that at an entity level, we still see people that have different policies in different countries, or even within the same country in different parts of the organisation. So having a common way or common policy within that policy is defining the materiality of a file. So again, it's the wood from the trees. What are the most important things? So in capturing that inventory is being able to have a common way of assessing the risk to that organization based on the risk appetite. I think by doing that, you then apply the most appropriate controls to the risk associated with that spreadsheet or EUC. So rather than applying a blanket entry-level controls to everything, you may do that, but that's a sort of a low level. So for example, we would have one organization, a big global organization, has in the region of over 10,000 EUCs. They only have 1,000 that are sort of deemed very critical and therefore require sort of the detailed audit trail collected for each version of that file or each significant version of that file. For the other 9,000 plus, it is really the control is the acknowledgement that it exists. It's the recertification that exists. We still rely on it, but at the moment it's not necessarily material. So I think there's and we have seen organisations that try and apply one size fits all to all the UCs, and that becomes too cumbersome. So it is that the risk appetite needs to be applied to that via the policy.
Thank you. Michael, have you got anything to add to that?
I think that really adequately addressed it. I mean, to me, I gave you some analogies to use, like the Titanic story and the Winchester Mystery House and things like that, is as far as like contextual analogies. But for the most part, you want to keep abreast of where auditors are applying pressure and provide that as a case study of why this is needed. As well as where there's been incidents, and we referenced some of those where there's been significant loss and exposure because of lack of end-user competing controls.
Okay, great. So I can't seem to see any more questions coming through. So with that, I'd like to take the time to thank Michael again once for joining us on this webinar, and thank you to you, Henry, as well. If anyone has got any questions that they didn't raise through the chat on the side of the webinar controls, then please do contact us. I'll just zip through to contact details here, so please feel free to contact Henry directly, and I'll forward here just to Michael's details as well. So once again, thank you very much for everybody for joining. The webinar will be available to watch on demand, and we will be sending a link round to that following this session, so that you can again go back and view it again at your own leisure. So once again, thank you very much.